All right. Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here tonight. I am Hannah Hodge with Springfield Community Gardens, a nonprofit based in Springfield, Missouri, whose vision is a community where everyone has access to healthy and local food. This workshop tonight is on growing and enjoying persimmon and pawpaw, and it's generously supported by the 2501 grant from the USDA Office of Partnerships and Public Engagement. Our speaker tonight is MU Extension Horticultural Field Specialist, Patrick Byers, and I'll let him introduce himself further in just a moment. Just some housekeeping before we get started. If you have questions throughout the night, please ask as we go. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can type in your question during the presentation, and we will stop periodically to chat with Patrick about them. There's also a chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Please only use this for comments. That helps me keep track of the questions throughout the night. And we will also do a Q&A at the end of the night. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions ahead of time. We really appreciate it. Your feedback is welcome. Also, once you leave this workshop, a screen will pop up with a link to a post-workshop survey. This survey is used in Springfield Community Gardens reporting to the USDA and also helps us provide meaningful workshops in the future. We would appreciate it if you would take a few minutes to fill this out after the workshop. If you would like to refer to this workshop later, it will be available on Springfield Community Gardens Agricultural Workshop playlist on our YouTube channel by the end of the week. I'll put that link as well as our website, social media, and tonight's exit survey in the chat in just one moment. All right, so that's it from me. And thank you all again for being here tonight. And now I'm going to hand it off to Patrick.
Thank you, Hannah. I am so excited to be with you here tonight to be talking about two of my favorite fruits. And that, of course, is pawpaw and persimmon. And I've enjoyed these fruits since I was a child. And it's interesting when I do these presentations, I always find kindred spirits in the audience. And everyone has a story about pawpaws or persimmons. And hopefully one day soon we'll be back together in person for in-person workshops, and we'll schedule these in the fall when we can sample pawpaws and sample persimmons and just really enjoy the bounty that we have here in the Ozarks. So let's go ahead and get started. And Hannah, I'm going to share my screen here.
Okay.
And let's see. Okay, can we see the presentation?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, let me go ahead and move these floating meeting controls. Okay, in Hannah's introduction, she introduced me. I'm Patrick Byers. I'm with University of Missouri Extension, and I'm based in Webster County in Southwest Missouri. And I've been an extension specialist for just a bit over 14 years. And prior to that, I worked for the Missouri State Fruit Experiment Station. Prior to that, I worked in the fruit breeding programs at the University of Arkansas. So you kind of get an idea of where my career has been focused. And I've been blessed to have worked with fruit crops and the farmers and home fruit enthusiasts who grow those crops over the course of a 35+ year career. But I am excited to be with you here tonight, and let's delve into pawpaws and persimmons. In addition to being an extension specialist, I'm also a farmer. And in previous years, I grew peaches. Now I've transitioned into elderberries. And particularly working with a crop like elderberries, it's opened my eyes to the possibilities of these native crops becoming profit centers for our farmers. And so I'll spend a certain amount of time tonight, hopefully promoting pawpaw and persimmon as potential commercial fruit crops. But we'll also be talking about these crops from the standpoint of interesting garden species or trees that you might include in a food forest, or even trees in a traditional landscape, because they are beautiful trees in their own right. And they're certainly trees of utility, providing delicious, nutritious fruit, certainly for those of us who are growing them, but also for wildlife of many different types found here in the Ozarks. Again, as Hannah mentioned in her introduction, tonight's workshop is a partnership between University of Missouri Extension and Springfield Community Gardens. And Springfield Community Gardens is a nonprofit grassroots organization in Southwest Missouri whose vision is a situation where everyone has access to healthy local food. And our workshop is also generously sponsored by the USDA. And funding from the USDA allows us to put on these workshops. There are a number of different programs available through USDA that are of interest to small-scale specialty crop farmers. So be sure to reach out to your local Farm Services Agency office for information on these programs. At that office, you'll learn more about the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, the Risk Management Agency, and other agencies that have services and programs of interest. All of this information can be found on the farmers.gov resources website. Okay, so what are we going to cover tonight? Well, we're going to delve into these two interesting native fruits. And with each fruit, we'll talk about native habits. We'll talk about improved cultivars, because there has been some interesting development of these two fruits, where we now have cultivars that have superior dessert qualities or qualities as fruits that could be marketed compared to their wild forebears. We'll talk about propagating these fruits. We'll talk about growing these fruits. And we'll talk a bit, as I said, about harvest, post-harvest, and marketing opportunities. And we're going to start with the pawpaw. The pawpaw is now Missouri's state fruit. And it's interesting. This was a situation, I think it was enacted about 3 years ago by the Missouri General Assembly at the request of a group of students in St. Louis. And I can't think of a better representative from the standpoint of fruit in Missouri than the pawpaw. Now, if we look at pawpaw, botanically speaking, it's Asaminah triloba. That's the genus and species of the pawpaw. And we can see in that lower map that it has a range over much of the eastern US. It's an interesting tree. It's actually a member of a family of trees, most of which are tropical. But this is the sole member of that family that can grow in colder climates. And you can see in that lower map that it grows all the way up into northern Illinois, Michigan, northern New York, and certainly Missouri. And the inset map of Missouri shows counties where pawpaws have been reported. I suspect if we did a thorough job of botanizing Missouri, we would find pawpaw in almost every county in Missouri. So what does pawpaw look like in the forest? Well, it's a small tree. It's a deciduous tree. It has lovely elongated leaves. The trees themselves are typically 5 to 10 meters or about 30 feet in height. And they usually are found in patches or groves. You may have heard the song Way Down Yonder, the Pawpaw Patch. Well, the reason for this is that pawpaw trees sucker readily from their roots, especially if those roots have been disturbed. And these suckers then will grow up into trees. And what was originally a single tree now is a group of trees. Now, in its native habitat, it's typically an understory tree. It will be kind of a spreading, thinly branched tree. But if we move it to a sunny location, the trees will assume a pyramidal habit. They have a straight trunk and beautiful, long, drooping leaves. The blossoms are of interest. They occur singly on the shoots that grew last season, and they can reach up to 5 centimeters in diameter. They emerge before the leaves in mid-spring, usually in April in Missouri, and they're a lovely maroon color. Now, the flowers are protogynous. They're also self-incompatible. What protogynous means is that the male parts of the flower mature and release pollen at a different time than when the female parts are receptive. This effectively prevents pollination from within the flower. And in fact, pawpaws require cross-pollination. This means that in the garden or on the farm, we need to plant more than one cultivar of pawpaw. Although there have been situations where trees have set fruit through self-pollination, but in general, for best crops, provide for cross-pollination. Now, the flowers are lovely, but when you get up close and sniff them, you'll notice a fetid aroma. The aroma of the flowers is designed to attract their pollinators, which are primarily carrion flies and beetles. So this is what pawpaw would look like in its native habitat. And this is a grove of pawpaws along a stream. And you can see, again, they're growing as an understory tree amongst other taller trees under the canopy. And they're kind of a smaller stature, kind of a gangly looking tree. Here's what the foliage looks like. Again, as I mentioned, it's lovely from the standpoint of its ornamental value. These are trees that are grown in full sun. Again, notice the differences in growth habit compared to the trees in their native habitat. They make a nice pyramidal shaped tree, as we can see when they're grown in the full sun. Here's a close-up of the blossoms. And again, they're just absolutely lovely. They look like maroon bells ranged up and down the shoots that grew last year. And we can see in that lower picture that we can have lots and lots of blossoms on a tree. Now let's take a look inside the flower. And here we can see the floral parts of the pawpaw blossom. At the very center, we see kind of a star-shaped body. That's actually the pistil of the pawpaw. That's the female part of the pawpaw flower. And around that, there is a grouping of stamens that release the pollen. This is the male part of the pawpaw flower. And notice in this picture that the male part, the stamens are actually releasing pollen. That's the dust that you see in that area. But the very center, the female part is not receptive yet. Typically, when the pistil of the pawpaw is receptive, it's going to be shiny and moist. So effectively, pollination cannot take place within the flower because the pollen and the female parts of the flower are receptive at different times. Here we can see the pollinators. In the lower picture, we see the bumble flower beetle, which is a primary pollinator of pawpaw. And the upper picture, we see a blowfly or a carrion fly pollinating a pawpaw blossom. Notice the grains of pollen on both of these insects as they move from flower to flower. And again, it's theorized that the fetid aroma of the pawpaw blossoms is designed to attract these two pollinators. Well, here's what the fruit looks like. It's typically borne in clusters. In some cases, we have single fruit that develop from a blossom, but in many cases, we have multiple fruit that develop from one blossom. And it could be 2, 3, or 5, or I've even seen clusters of 7 fruit coming from a single blossom. Now, in the native situation, pawpaw fruit ripens in late summer, typically in late August and September. And wild trees, while they will produce fruit that can be harvested, typically produce fruit that is variable in quality. And typically, a typical wild tree will have small fruit. The fruit tends to be quite seedy, as we can see in the picture there, the fruit cut open. And oftentimes the flavors can be a bit off. In fact, I've tasted native or wild pawpaws that have a flavor reminiscent of turpentine. Now, pawpaw is an important wildlife food. It's eagerly sought out by wildlife such as bears, raccoons, possums, foxes, and a number of different birds. Okay, do we have any questions at this point, Hannah?
Not at this time, but if you do have a question, feel free to pop it in the Q&A and we will answer it shortly.
Yes, I'll plan to stop periodically during the presentations to see if there are any questions. Okay, well, let's turn our attention now to pawpaw cultivars. And when we think about the pawpaw, of course, it is a native fruit. And Native Americans and early settlers and later farmers utilized wild trees. And in fact, wild trees are still harvested by foragers. And if you happen to find a grove of pawpaw that produces good quality fruit, that's a find to cherish. Now, from an early stage, people did recognize that particular trees had superior fruit. Perhaps the fruit was larger than a typical wild pawpaw. Perhaps it was more flesh compared to the seeds. Perhaps the flavor was good. Well, these superior wild trees were collected and propagated and brought into culture. And this is the origin of our first group of improved pawpaws. In more recent times, particularly from the early 80s onward, we saw the development of breeding programs that were designed to help improve pawpaw. Neil Peterson was a pawpaw enthusiast in Maryland and West Virginia who really made a significant contribution to developing superior pawpaws. And now there are other breeding programs, such as the breeding program at Kentucky State University, that are producing improved pawpaws. And these improved types of pawpaw are gathered together periodically into cultivar trials, where they're tested side by side to see which ones are indeed superior. And we have done such cultivar trials here in Missouri. Now, what would we like to see in an improved pawpaw? Well, let's look at the tree first. It would be nice if the tree was of reasonable size so that it would be easier to harvest the pawpaw fruit. It would be nice if that tree would come into bearing at a young age. It'd be nice if the tree had vigorous growth, but didn't require a lot of inputs from the standpoint of management. We want a tree with strong branch structure, high flower density, a high fruit set under natural pollination. Quite frankly, the bumble beetles and various types of flies just oftentimes don't do a completely adequate job of pollinating. And we can have a heavy set of blossoms and then a very light set of fruit just because of issues with pollination. So we're certainly interested in pawpaws that are very fertile from the standpoint of being able to set a crop of fruit. It would be nice to have trees that had consistently high fruit yields and trees that could take cold and drought. Let's take a look at the fruit. Here's what we'd like to see on an improved pawpaw. We'd like to have over 40 fruit per tree. We'd like to have a sweet flavor, a firm texture, a delicate blend of flavors. So a good pawpaw has a rich aromatic flavor, but it's not cloyingly sweet and there's no bitter aftertaste. It would be nice to have a fruit that was mostly flesh. And we do have some improved pawpaws that have less than 5% of the seed or of the fruit weight that is actually seed. And this is a huge improvement over wild pawpaws, where frequently 50% or more of the fruit weight is actually seed. Nice to have large fruit. It'd be nice to have seeds that were small. And we wanted an attractive pawpaw. You can see on this picture here that some pawpaws have bright, clear colors. Others are kind of mottled or brownish looking. In fact, some of them look almost like they're going bad when indeed they're not. And it'd be nice to have pawpaw fruit that had bright, clear colors and that a fruit that was even and symmetrical in size. Here's an example of a side-by-side comparison with a wild pawpaw on the left and improved pawpaw, specifically Shenandoah on the right. So we can see that indeed pawpaw breeders have developed fruit that is superior in size to wild pawpaws. I mentioned yes.
Sorry, we have a couple of questions.
Excellent.
Just in regards to the pawpaw breeders. So there are two questions. One, Denise Vaughn asks, I live in northern Stone County. I have a native pawpaw patch, and what variety would you recommend?
So if you have a native pawpaw patch and you're looking for a pollinator, I'm going to give you some thoughts on which ones to plant here in a moment. But there's some excellent ones out there that you could plant near your native pawpaws, and that would ensure cross-pollination for both the tree that you plant and also the native pawpaws that are there. And in fact, if you have room for more than one tree, I would definitely plant at least two of these improved pawpaw cultivars. I think you'll find them to be just wonderful, wonderful trees with delicious fruit.
Awesome. And then the second question from Willoughby is, how old is a pawpaw before it starts producing fruit?
Our experience with grafted pawpaw trees, and we'll talk more about that in a moment as well, is that they set their first fruit in their third or fourth year. So they need a couple of years to grow and get established and get some height on, and then they begin to blossom and set fruit. And a pawpaw tree will be in its full production typically by year 7 or 8, somewhere in that time frame. Now, if you plant a pawpaw seed and grow a seedling tree, it may be much, much longer before that tree will produce fruit. It could be as much as 5 or 6 years, perhaps even longer, before you would see fruit on a seedling tree. So there is an advantage to planting a grafted tree because it will come into production earlier.
Thanks so much. That's it on the questions.
Okay, very good. Keep those questions coming. So our most recent pawpaw cultivar trial here in Missouri was in 2003, and we had 2 sites at Mount Vernon and at Mountain Grove, and we planted these cultivars: Sunflower, PA Golden, Wells, NC1, Overley, Shenandoah, Susquehanna, and 10-35. And we tested these over 8 years of growth and production, and I'll share some of the data here with you. So if we look at the average yield in pounds per tree, again, remember this planting was planted in 2000. Let's see, it was planted in 2003, and by 2008 we were definitely into cropping, and we can see looking at 2008, 2009, and 2010 how the yield would build over time. And some pawpaw cultivars, of course, were more productive than others. And if we look at these data, we'll notice that the cultivar Shenandoah and PA Golden, and let's see, where's the other one that stuck out? Sunflower were particularly productive, but we had reasonable yields on all of these cultivars that were in the trial. And so, again, we continued to look at these for several years. The sorting out pretty much stayed in place as we see here. And I'll mention too that these pawpaws are listed in order of ripening. So PA Golden is an early pawpaw and Wells is a late pawpaw. If we look at the average number of fruit per tree, we can see, let's just look at 2010. And we can see on our trees, for example, on PA Golden, we had a lot of fruit, over 400 fruit per tree. Now, the trade-off, as we'll see here in a moment, is the PA Golden is a smaller pawpaw. But looking at cultivars like Shenandoah, which had over 200 fruit per tree, and 10-35, which also had over 200 fruit per tree, these were very productive pawpaw trees. And then looking at fruit size, the clear winner here was Susquehanna. And, looking back at the previous data, it wasn't the most productive from the standpoint of overall yield or number of fruit, but certainly had large fruit size. And we can see, again, as I mentioned, PA Golden is a fairly small pawpaw, though a very productive tree. So when you're thinking about the best pawpaw to plant, you've got to look at the whole package. You've got to look at how productive the tree is. You've got to look at the ripening season, the number of fruit on the tree, and of course, the average fruit size to figure out which pawpaw is right for you. One thing else that we looked at in 2008 was the percentage of pulp to seeds. And looking at these figures here, we can see that a number of the pawpaws had a very nice ratio of pulp to seed. Anything over about 60% is really good. Now, PA Golden, being a small fruit, had a little bit less than 50% pulp to seed. But if we look at cultivars like Sunflower and Shenandoah, Susquehanna, NC1, these all had wonderful, wonderful ratios of pulp to seed, meaning there's a lot of fruit to eat there that's not seed. We also had similar data from a trial, more recent trial, or I'm sorry, same sort of time frame as the Mountain Grove and Mount Vernon trial at the University of Missouri Horticulture Research Center near Columbia. So if you're from Central Missouri, this information would be of interest to you as well. But again, notice that we had a number of these that seem quite well adapted to Missouri. Now, if we look at ripening order, the early ripening pawpaws are PA Golden and 10-35. Mid-season would be Overleaf, NC1, Shenandoah, and Sunflower. And late ripening pawpaws are Susquehanna and Wells. Now, what does this really mean? A typical pawpaw tree will ripen fruit over about a 3-week period. PA Golden will start typically sometime in late August. Susquehanna begins to ripen sometime, usually the 2nd or 3rd week in September. So by planting early ripening and mid-season and late ripening cultivars, you can easily have a 5 to 6 week period of harvest of pawpaws from your trees. On the other hand, if you want a concentrated harvest season, you might plant 2 early ripening cultivars and get all of your pawpaw harvest out of the way early in the season. So after all of this cultivar trial information gathered together, and we've analyzed the data and looked at all the different sites, here are the ones that we feel are well suited for Missouri. So based on our work in Missouri, PA Golden, Sunflower, Shenandoah, Susquehanna, and NC1 seem to be well suited for growing in Missouri. And then based upon trials elsewhere, there are some newer cultivars available that we feel are worthy of trial. And, there's some overlap here. These trials were in places like Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and looking at what the collaborators found in their trials, Potomac, Susquehanna, Wabash, Overleaf, Shenandoah, NC1, and Sunflower are all considered to be good pawpaws, and we feel that these are worthy of an additional trial here in Missouri. Let's take a kind of an up-close look at some of these cultivars. And I mentioned Neil Peterson and his contribution to improving the pawpaw. His first 2 types developed were Susquehanna and Shenandoah, and you can see pictures there. Shenandoah is a more rounded fruit. Susquehanna is a bit elongated. Both are fabulous from the standpoint of flavor. Both have a high ratio of pulp to seed. Susquehanna is later ripening than Shenandoah. They have a wonderful, again, aroma and just everything you could want in a pawpaw. But Neil didn't stop there. He continued his work and developed additional cultivars. You'll notice that these are all named in honor of eastern rivers. So rivers like the Shenandoah, the Susquehanna, the Potomac, the Rappahannock, the Wabash, and so on. In our experience, the cultivars developed in Neil Peterson's program have all uniformly been good quality. We have not trialed some of these cultivars like Potomac, Allegheny, or Rappahannock in depth here in Missouri. So we still have to consider those for trial planting. But certainly Shenandoah and Susquehanna have proven themselves. Here's PA Golden, that wonderful early season cultivar that I mentioned. Again, a little bit smaller than some of the others, but definitely early, very productive, good quality fruit. Sunflower, you might have some inkling of where sunflower was found. This was a wild pawpaw that was brought into cultivation, found in Kansas, and given the name sunflower, and it's proven to be a good quality pawpaw as well. NC1 is a pawpaw cultivar that was developed in North Carolina, as you might imagine. To my knowledge, it hasn't been given an actual name yet. It's still being trialed under the selection number of NC1. Now, I touched earlier on the advantages of grafted trees versus seedling trees. With seedling trees, we have to recognize that we really don't know what the production and fruit quality is going to be like until they come into bearing. And that may be a long, long time. Grafted trees, we know what the fruit quality is going to be like because a grafted tree is a known cultivar. And grafted trees come into production easily 2 to 4 years earlier than ungrafted trees. Now, granted, seedling trees are cheaper than grafted trees, but because of the advantages, we typically recommend grafted trees, certainly for commercial plantings, but for home orchards as well. Now, seedlings are useful as rootstocks, and pawpaw is typically propagated through one of the various types of grafting using a seedling tree as the rootstock or the root system. Now, let's talk a little bit about how to propagate pawpaws. From seed, pawpaws will germinate, but there are a couple of tips that you definitely want to keep in mind. As you're extracting seed from ripe pawpaw fruit, do not allow it to dry out. The percentage of germination will drop dramatically if the seed is allowed to dry out. Also, don't freeze the seed. Pawpaw seed is sensitive to freezing. So once you collect the seed from the fruit, clean it up, keep it moist, and then place it in moist peat moss, and then stratify for about 4 months at 32 to 40 degrees. And after about, 3.5 months, start look at the seeds. And if you begin to see the emergence of roots, it's time to pull the seeds out of stratification and pot them up. And you can plant these seeds in spring. Generally best to plant them in containers, unless you're going to a field graft pawpaw. In that case, you might plant the seeds where you want the eventual tree to grow and then perform the grafting operation on the seeds that grow on that point. But in most situations, pawpaw seed are sowed in containers. And then once the seedling germinates and grows and is grafted, the container grown tree is then easily transplanted to the orchard. Now, several different methods of grafting can be used with pawpaw. Chip budding is commonly used and widely successful, and that's what we see there. Those are pictures of chip budded pawpaws. But you can also use cleft grafting, whip and tongue grafting, or the types of grafts used by various grafting tools. Pawpaw is actually a fairly easy subject to graft. Here we see some close-ups. These are trees that eventually went into our cultivar trials. And if you look closely at that tree in the very center, you can see that where the chip bud was inserted onto the seedling rootstock. And that shoot that is growing will eventually become the new tree. Here's another grafted pawpaw tree after, perhaps another month and a half. And we can see a nice shoot growing out there, which will, again, in time, become the trunk of our new tree. And some more pictures of grafted pawpaws. Okay, once we've propagated our trees, then we need to think about establishment and production. And pawpaw is a hardy tree. It's adapted to all of Missouri, certainly through Zone 5. Choose a spot that has full sun and a well-drained soil. Pawpaws don't do well, even though you typically find them in moist areas in their native habitat, they are still growing in well-drained soils, and they just will not tolerate poorly drained soils. A pH of about 5.5 to 7, and a soil test will give you useful information from the standpoint of the pH at your site. We generally suggest planting in the spring. There have been some evidence from trials elsewhere that fall planting is less successful, so plant in the spring, and container-grown plants work great for establishing pawpaw. 6 to 8 feet between trees and 18 to 20 feet between rows. Now, From the standpoint of providing shelter, there's a benefit if you're growing your own trees, especially seedling trees, to providing a shelter for the first growing season. Typically, grafted nursery trees do not need shelter, although some farmers will put tree tubes around grafted trees as well to provide a bit of protection against rodents and deer and also a bit of shelter. First crop in year 3 to 4 and full production by years 7 to 8. So here is a happy guy out establishing a pawpaw orchard. And you can see we've cleared the site and dug the holes, and I'm using container grown pawpaws. You can see the container there off to the side and planting the trees. As far as shelter, it could be a shelter as we see in the lower left, which is made with concrete reinforcing wire and then burlapped tied on top, or it could be a tree tube as we see over on the right side. If your tree is taller than 45 centimeters, then typically there's no need for a shelter. Here we can see a pawpaw tree that is certainly large enough to not need a shelter, and then the smaller tree behind it that's growing in the tree tube. Here's a pawpaw orchard in year 2, and we can see the nicely established stand of trees. That same orchard in year 5. And here's a mature pawpaw tree, again, 15 to 30 feet in height, 8 to 10 feet in spread. We don't have a clear understanding of how long a pawpaw tree will be productive and quite frankly, live in the landscape. We do know of trees that are 25 years old or perhaps even a bit older. But we also have seen some indication in orchard settings that trees may not last as long perhaps as, say, an apple or a pear tree might. Now, some thoughts on growing pawpaws. Pawpaws will need to be irrigated during dry periods. They're definitely not drought-tolerant trees. So design your planting so that you can easily irrigate during dry periods. As far as fertilization, typically nitrogen is the nutrient that's needed each year. And we gradually over time build from about 1 ounce of nitrogen per tree in the first year to 5 to 6 ounces of nitrogen for year 6 and beyond. Pawpaws will not compete well with weeds, so keep those weeds under control. You can use mulching. If you do choose to use tillage around your tree, either by hand with a hoe or a rake or with a tiller, make sure that it's very, very shallow. If you till deeply, you run the risk of damaging the root system, and one of the responses of damaged root systems on pawpaws is an abundance of suckers, and those suckers become a challenge. So you definitely want to manage things so that you don't have to deal with lots of suckers. Now, pruning is generally pretty minimal with pawpaw. We see orchardists using central leader systems similar to what would be used with an apple or a pear. And we can see that in this picture here where there's a central trunk that runs up the height of the tree. And then the branches that arise off of that trunk, the scaffold branches, we want to try to develop wide angles so that we have a strong structure on the pawpaw tree. Okay, now let's talk a bit about getting a crop of pawpaws on our trees. And this will be a discussion of pollination, fruit set, and development. Now, as I mentioned, yes.
Sorry to interrupt. We got a couple of questions before you get
fabulous.
All right. Stephanie asks, I purchased 2 pawpaw trees from different sellers in the hopes that they would pollinate better than buying multiple ones from the same seller. That's interesting. Where can you find the pawpaw varieties that you've suggested?
You'll need to seek them out. Here in Missouri, a good source is a nursery called Forest Keeling Nursery, and they are located in Northeast Missouri. Stark Brothers Nursery also offers pawpaws. There's a nursery called One Green World that offers pawpaws, and I'm sure there are other pawpaw sources out there as well. I don't mean to endorse a particular nursery, but those are nurseries that have good reputations that have supplied pawpaws.
Awesome. And then Family Tree Co-op asks, what tree species can be used to graft pawpaw onto?
So typically, propagating pawpaw using grafting, it's a situation where you're grafting pawpaw onto pawpaw. There are no other closely related rootstocks that would be compatible with fruiting pawpaw. So generally, we collect seeds from pawpaw fruit, plant the seeds, grow a seedling tree, and graft onto that seedling tree as the rootstock.
And do you suggest using saran wrap to graft around that to keep it connected?
There are different ways to graft and to protect the graft following the grafting process. And I'll mention that I have a series of fruit tree grafting videos available at the Webster County YouTube channel. So if you do a search for Webster County Extension YouTube, you'll come up with our channel. And there's, I believe there's 7 different videos on different grafting techniques there. And any of those techniques can be adapted for use with pawpaw. Saran wrap does work well, but I tend to favor a material called parafilm, which is a very thin plastic sheet that has a layer of paraffin that I can then wrap around the grafted tree. It's strong enough that it stabilizes the graft union. And because of the wax layer, it keeps the graft union from drying out before healing takes place.
So it's like wax based. Okay.
Yes, it's a bit like that.
So 2 more. One, Willoughby asks, do you know what the cultivar is that MDC sells through the state nursery?
The pawpaws that are sold through the state nursery are seedling trees. And because they're seedling trees, they're just, I mean, if you plant, let's say that you purchase a bundle of 50 pawpaw trees from the MDC nursery and you plant them out. Well, you have 15 different trees, genetically speaking, and you'll have a range of different types of fruit on those trees. Now, likely those seeds did come from a pawpaw orchard. So there's a good chance that you have some good genetics there. And you may actually have some trees that have decent fruit, but you'll also likely have some trees that have small fruit or that aren't very productive or that have off flavors. You just never know when you plant a seedling tree.
So that ties into the next question. I recommend, so Lori Williamson asks, I recommended pawpaws from MDC, which I assume is Missouri Department of Conservation, correct?
Yes, correct.
But they do not know or offer the variety. I'm hoping to cross with the wild pawpaws growing in my creek. Thoughts?
That will certainly work. Again, remember when you plant a seedling tree that it is unique genetically, and it will certainly serve as a pollinator for other seedling trees in the neighborhood. So your plan is an excellent plan. I have heard of people purchasing pawpaw trees from the MDC nursery and then using those trees as rootstocks for grafting. And why not? They would be excellent rootstocks for grafting, for placing improved pawpaws onto.
Awesome. That's it on the question.
Okay, very good. So from the standpoint of pollination, as I mentioned, there are some challenges you have to provide for cross-pollination. And in many cases, we just don't have a lot of the pollinating insects present that pollinate pawpaws. There are some benefits to what's called hand pollination. And I'll show you that here in a moment. Once you are successful from the standpoint of pollination, you can end up with single fruit or sometimes clusters. And I've read reports of up to 9 fruit per cluster. I've never seen that, but I have seen 7 pawpaw fruit in a single cluster. And growers will sometimes thin clusters to improve fruit size. If you have a cluster that has 7 fruit in it, each individual fruit's going to be pretty small. But if you thin that down to 2 or 3 fruit, then you'll develop large size fruit. The other issue we see is if you have a large cluster of pawpaws, as they grow, they tend to push the neighboring fruit off of the cluster, and then that fruit drops to the ground and is lost. So thinning early on is a good practice to develop large size fruit and an abundant crop on the tree. Okay, so let's take a look inside pawpaw flowers. As I mentioned, they're protogynous, which means that the female organs are receptive before the pollen is mature. If we look at that upper picture, we can see the pistil in the very center. It's kind of star-shaped, nice and shiny and moist. This pistil is receptive, but notice around it that we don't see any powder. There's no pollen that's ready. But if we look at the lower picture, we can see a situation where the pistil is no longer receptive, but now we have viable pollen in that flower. So this effectively prevents pollination within the flower. We have to move pollen from flower to flower for pollination to take place. And this can be done by hand. And the way it's done is you collect pollen from flowers that have receptive stamens, the male parts, and using a camel's brush, you can see it in the very center there, we just transfer that pollen to receptive pistils. Again, we're looking for a pistil that is moist and shiny. And by doing this, you can greatly improve the fruit set on a pawpaw tree. As I mentioned, fruit will develop from successful pollinations. The large picture shows a group of fruit, and it's sometimes called a hand. And this particular hand has 5 fruit developing. Typically, we don't want 5 fruit, and we'll generally thin this down to 2 or 3 fruit. So here's an example of what happens when you thin down to 2 fruit. You have 2 wonderful sized pawpaws. Here's another nice example, thinned down to 3 fruit. This is a not so good situation where we didn't thin the fruit. To notice again that we have misshapen fruit, we have some that are small, some that are very small, and just not a good situation from the standpoint of fruit quality. We likely should have thinned that hand down to 2 or 3 fruit. Now, a quick discussion on disease issues. And in general, pawpaws are relatively pest-free. Although we have seen some leaf spotting diseases on pawpaws in Missouri, typically they're not serious issues. The one that I have pictures of here, Phylosticta spot, can be a bit of a problem. And you'll notice that it causes spots on the foliage, but it can also cause spots on the fruit. And if it's serious enough, it can cause the fruit to split open, as we see in the lower picture. Typically, though, we don't recommend a spray program for pawpaw. Looking at these 2 trees, we see, first of all, the tree on the right is a seedling tree that unfortunately was very susceptible to Phylosticta leaf spot. You can see it's lost most of its foliage. But if you look behind it, you can see the trees of the named varieties that have resistance to Phylosticta, and you can see they're looking much better. Now, there are some insect issues we need to be aware of. There is a pest called the Pawpaw peduncle borer, and this insect actually will chew the stems of the pawpaw fruit, causing the fruit to drop. A Japanese beetle will devour the foliage on pawpaws. There is a leaf-rolling insect, a moth, that the caterpillars are in groups, and they roll the leaves on the pawpaw trees, and then they eat the leaves within the sort of the tent they've created. The larva of the zebra swallowtail will consume pawpaw foliage, and typically, in fact, in almost every case, this isn't a pest. And in fact, I encourage zebra swallowtail caterpillars when I find them on pawpaws. There's a pest called the Asian ambrosia beetle, which bores into the trunk of the pawpaw. Spotted-winged Drosophila, a tiny fruit fly, can be a pest on pawpaw, and brown marmorated stink bug. Both of these last 2 insects are invasive insects, and both of them are reported to feed on pawpaw. So here's some pictures. The top picture on the left is the effects of leaf roll, and you can see how the leaves have been skeletonized. The peduncle borer, that's the picture in the middle. It's actually chewing away at the flower stem and at the blossom. Asian ambrosia beetle there at the top on the right, and then the larva of the zebra swallowtail, lower right. Okay, so now we've planted trees, we've selected cultivars, we planted trees, and they're old enough to produce fruit. Now we're expecting our first crop of pawpaws. So how do we know when they're ripe? Well, the ripening season in Missouri is in August and September, and you can tell a ripe pawpaw because the fruit softens and it has that very distinctive, powerful aroma. Sometimes there's a skin color change from green to green yellow. Frequently, there is a flesh color change. Unripe pawpaws, the flesh is greenish, but as pawpaws ripen, that flesh color changes to creamy white through bright yellow, and we have improved pawpaws that have orange flesh. There's 2 rows of seeds inside, and as I mentioned before, the fruit ripens over several weeks. Here's the harvest off of several different types of pawpaws. When you cut the fruit open, again, there's 2 rows of seeds. You can see 1 row here on the slice on the right. The other row of seeds is buried within the slice on the left. Now, as far as signs to harvest, when the fruit softens and the fruit releases from the tree, this is a good indication of when it's ready to harvest. Now, you can't base this strictly on skin color. You have to actually feel the firmness of the fruit. You want to harvest frequently, and you want to harvest carefully because the fruit is very perishable and easy to damage at this point. Short shelf life, 2 to 3 days at room temperature, but if you refrigerate them at about 39 degrees, you can store pawpaw for up to 3 weeks. There will be some changes in flavor, but in general, the fruit is still usable after cold storage. At this point, let's watch a couple of videos here related to pawpaws. Okay, this first video is a discussion of when to harvest pawpaws.
Pawpaws ripen in Missouri in late August and September. Now, the signs that a pawpaw fruit is ripening is first of all a change in the ground color. An unripe pawpaw and a ripe pawpaw. The ground color changes from green to cream or yellow. Some cultivars will have brownish areas on the fruit as well. The second clue is the firmness of the fruit. Unripe pawpaw, very firm. As a pawpaw ripens, the flesh softens and it yields to gentle finger pressure. And third, the development of the characteristic pawpaw aroma. Oh my goodness, what a wonderful fragrance. And that aroma is noticeable in the orchard as the fruit begins to ripen. Harvest pawpaws before they drop from the tree. This is a good stage at which to ripen. Again, the ground color has changed, it yields to gentle pressure, and the aroma is there. Harvest them carefully into lugs or other containers. Do not place them more than 2 deep in the container because the fruit are fragile and they'll easily bruise. If pawpaws are allowed to drop from the tree, invariably the fruit will be damaged. And there's also produce food safety concerns if the fruit drops to the ground. As soon as possible after harvest, market the fruit, process it, or otherwise place it into cold storage. Pawpaws can be held in cold storage for varying lengths of time.
Okay, and let me bring up a second video. Okay, Hannah, can we see this video?
Yes, that looks great.
Okay.
As pawpaws ripen, the ground color changes to cream or gold, sometimes with brownish areas. The flesh softens, it gives to gentle finger pressure, and the aroma of the ripe pawpaw develops. Now, after the pawpaws are harvested, we can cut a slice out here and notice that the texture of the ripe fruit is like a very firm banana. Now, within the pawpaw are several rows of large seeds. We can see the seeds here. When processing pawpaw, the seeds are removed and then the pulp is then collected. It can be then used immediately in value-added or processed products such as baked goods, frozen treats such as ice cream or custard, or in fermented products such as beer. The pulp can also be separated from the skins and the seeds and frozen for later sales.
Okay, let's go back to the presentation.
Awesome. We have a question.
Yes.
The Family Tree Co-op asks, where do we get gent camel brush for hand pollination?
So you can find those sorts of brushes at an art supply store, but it's actually very similar to the brush that comes in a watercolor paint kit. And that's generally a less expensive way to get a hold of that brush. What you need is a small size brush that has fairly fine bristles.
That's it on the questions.
Okay, are we back to the presentation?
Yes, that looks great.
Okay. So from the standpoint of marketing pawpaws, here's some realities. It's always good to do a reality check. The fruit is fragile. It has a short shelf life unless you refrigerate it. It does not ship well. Consumers, there's just a limited consumer awareness. You would think with a native fruit that is so delicious and wonderful that more people would be aware of it, but surprisingly, that's not the case. And it does take some promotional effort to acquaint people with the delights of pawpaw. And the processing market is not well developed either. I'll just share a couple of stories here. I have a friend who's a restaurateur, a high-end restaurant, and I was very curious what he would do with pawpaw. So I provided him with about 100 pounds of pawpaw fruit, and he made this amazing, just simply amazing ice cream based upon pawpaw. And it was made, I think, basically using a banana ice cream recipe, but substituting pawpaw for the banana. And it was a fabulous product, very popular at the restaurant. And he blessed me with a gallon of it. Just absolutely wonderful. And then from the standpoint of consumer awareness, back in 2019, our team did a farmers market survey with pawpaws. And we provided samples of fresh pawpaw fruit and also a gluten-free muffin made with pawpaw. And we asked people to rate the experience of tasting it, to whether or not they've ever tried pawpaws, and whether they would be interested in further experiences with pawpaws. And only, it was interesting, less than 20% of the people at the farmers markets had actually tasted a pawpaw. But of those who sampled our pawpaws, over 80% said they loved the experience and they wanted to buy pawpaws. So even though there's limited consumer awareness, once people sample pawpaws, they are hooked. So again, why the buzz about pawpaw? Well, it's delicious, it's unusual, it's a native fruit, it's antioxidant rich, again, very nutritious. I really can't stress that enough. And it's also versatile in the kitchen. This is several members of our pawpaw team, and I provided them with I think this was Shenandoah fruit to sample, and it was interesting. The guy on the right is saying, "Oh, this is wonderful. I want more." The guy in the middle is saying, "Oh, I'm not so sure about this," and the lady on the left, she just absolutely loves pawpaws. There are marketing opportunities for fresh fruit, certainly at farmers markets. I tried to track down some pricing information, and here's what I found as far as local fresh fruit: about $4.50 a pound. Internet sales of fresh fruit, over $10 a pound. You can certainly pulp the fruit and then use the pulp in various value-added products, or freeze it for sales of frozen pulp. Again, trying to find some prices. Local frozen pulp, $6.25 a pound, and again, over $9 a pound for frozen pulp on the internet. What can you do with pawpaws? Ice cream, smoothies, custard, cookies, breads, beer, wine. All kinds of fabulous products can be made from pawpaws. We have two excellent resources on pawpaws. Our Growing and Marketing Pawpaw in Missouri guide was just produced this past spring, so it's hot off the press. And then there was a video out there that I produced called Pawpaw Production, so check that out as well. And they're sort of companion resources. And I'm not going to go through them. And so feel free to come back to the recording and check out some of these resources, in addition to the two that I just mentioned that are Missouri specific. I do want to thank Neil Peterson and Dr. Kirk Pomper, who are two of the leading spirits related to pawpaw nationally. You heard I introduced Neil earlier. Dr. Kirk Pomper oversees the National Collection of Pawpaw cultivars at Kentucky State University. Okay, so do we have any questions on pawpaw before we dive into persimmon?
Let's see. No questions at this time, but feel free to submit questions if you need.
Okay, so let's talk about persimmons now. So the persimmon too is native to much of the eastern U.S., perhaps not as far north as pawpaw, but still much the same range as pawpaw. Botanically speaking, it's Diospyros virginiana, and we find it across Missouri, particularly the southern 2/3 of the state, and it's typically a small to medium-sized tree, although I have seen persimmon trees that have reached 60 to 70 feet, but typically it's going to be a much smaller statured tree. And just to give you a feel for persimmon and its native habits, you can recognize it even during the dormant season by its very distinctive bark. I've heard this called tire track bark, but it's a very roughened bark with large bark segments. The fruit, of course, is a clue. There's really nothing else that's like persimmon fruit. And in the center there, we see a tree and a persimmon orchard. And typically wild trees will be about that size, maybe a little bit taller. Now, Persimmon has some interesting flowering characteristics too, just like pawpaw does. And in the case of persimmon, trees are typically dioecious. And this means that the male and female flowers appear on separate trees. So you essentially have male trees and female trees. Now, the female trees produce pistillate flowers, and that's what we see up there at the top. And the pistillate flowers are what develop into the persimmon fruit. The lower picture shows the staminate or the male flowers, and all of those flowers are not going to set fruit, but they're critically important because they produce the pollen that must be transferred to the pistillate flowers for pollination and fruit set to take place. So what does this mean? Well, this means you need to have some male trees somewhere in the neighborhood of your fruiting persimmon trees, and you can actually purchase male cultivars, and this is a good idea if you're thinking about growing persimmon as an orchard tree. So, improved persimmon cultivars. Like pawpaw, the first efforts to improve the American persimmon were by looking at native wild trees and selecting those that were superior. And we still have some of those in cultivation. But in more recent years, again, sort of organized improvement has taken place through the efforts of Claypool, Lehman, and others. And like pawpaw, we've had persimmon cultivar trials to evaluate these improved cultivars. And we have a very extensive orchard of persimmons at the University of Missouri Southwest Research, Education, and Extension Center in Mount Vernon. And if you're ever in Mount Vernon, at the area in late September, early October, and you'd like to see these different cultivars, feel free to reach out. Typically, they love to have visitors, and particularly someone who has an interest in persimmons. Now, what would we like to see in improved persimmon? Well, some of these are the same characteristics that we talked about with pawpaw, but we would like to have a situation with a long ripening period, good fruit quality. The calyx, that's that kind of papery part of the fruit that adheres to the fruit. We'd like to have that stay on the fruit when it drops from the tree rather than staying behind on the tree. We've got delicious American persimmons, but we could do some things to improve the flavor. What would be really nice, though, is to have fruit, first of all, that's tough enough with a skin that's tough enough to hold the fruit together when it's harvested. It'd be nice to have reduced seed size, and in fact, it'd be nice to have seedless persimmons, maybe someday. It'd be nice to have non-astringent persimmons. The American persimmon has tannins in the flesh of the fruit that are there until the fruit is dead ripe. And if you eat a fruit that is not dead ripe, those tannins react with the proteins in your saliva, and essentially you have a very unpleasant experience in your mouth. Other things we'd like to see, again, eliminate black spots in the fruit, better pulp color, and fruit that is easier to handle. Now here's a side-by-side comparison of a native wild persimmon on the right and an improved persimmon. This particular cultivar is Yates on the left. You can see that persimmon enthusiasts have made great strides in improving persimmon size. Our most recent persimmon cultivar trial was established in 2004, and that included these cultivars that we see here. And this orchard is still in place at the Southwest Research Center, and we've added to it significantly as other persimmon cultivars have become available. Now, looking at some of the data from 2011, 2012, and 2013, this is yield per tree, and keep in mind that this yield is in grams, but it still gives us a feel for which trees are going to be productive trees. And again, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is available on the recording if you'd like to look at it more closely. The same thing with fruit size. I will mention anytime you have a persimmon fruit that is larger than 25 grams in size, this is a significant improvement over wild fruit. And we can see looking here that cultivars like A118 and Yates and others have wonderful fruit from the standpoint of large size. I mentioned Claypool. Mr. Claypool is a very interesting person. He early on conceived an interest in improving the American persimmon. And the way he did this was by collecting seeds from wild trees across the eastern U.S. and planting those seeds on his farm near St. Elmo, Illinois. And I think he planted 17 rows of persimmons, and each row was a half mile long. So you can imagine how many persimmon trees Mr. Claypool had to look at. And indeed, a number of the trees in his orchard, including Dollywood, Early Jewel, and Elmo, were good enough to be named and released for people to grow. So certainly, Jim Claypool made a significant contribution to improving the American persimmon. What about seedlessness? Well, there was one tree in Mr. Claypool's orchard, I-94. It was in row I and was tree number 94 that had fruit that was not always seedless, but occasionally seedless. And if we look at the cross sections of those fruit down there, we notice that the fruit at the top is essentially seedless. The one at the bottom has 3 seeds in, compared to a typical persimmon, which has 7 to 9 seeds. This is definitely an improvement. And if we look at the picture up at the upper left, we can see that compared to a $50, it's a fairly good sized fruit. So we're excited. I-94, we don't know that it's large enough or has other qualities that would recommend it for commercial production, but certainly it has the advantage of fewer seeds than a typical American persimmon. Here's a group shot of different persimmons that are in our trial at Mount Vernon. And again, you can see differences in fruit size, differences in the color of the fruit, just a nice diversity of different types of fruit on American pawpaws in that particular study. There's also been an effort to hybridize the American persimmon with the Asian persimmon. The Asian persimmon is sometimes called the khaki persimmon, and this is the persimmon that we see in the markets in late fall and winter. Tends to be large fruit, tends to be very firm-fleshed. There are seedless and non-astringent types. And again, the hybrids were developed hopefully to capture some of those desirable Asian persimmon traits and transmit them to American persimmons. And in our trials, the only ones that we've looked at so far are Rossianka and Nikita's Gift, and they have not been as productive as we would have hoped. But individually, the fruit is large and of good quality. Unfortunately, not seedless. Propagating persimmons, again, much like pawpaws, collect the seeds from the fruit, don't allow them to dry, stratify them as we talked about with persimmons, and as they begin to germinate, transplant the seeds into containers or plant them in the field where you'd like the eventual persimmon trees to grow. Persimmons are easy to propagate through several different grafting techniques. They can be field grafted. You can also propagate persimmons from cuttings, either root or twig cuttings. Field grafting works really well. And this is the way I've propagated persimmons. I typically plant 5 seeds at each spot where I want a tree, allow those seeds to grow and plant them in the fall. Don't let them dry out. They'll naturally stratify over winter, then they'll germinate and grow in the spring. And after 2 to 3 years, they're large enough to field graft. You can also grow seedlings in containers and graft onto those as well. 15 to 20 feet between trees in your orchard and about 20 feet between the rows of trees in your orchard. There's really not a lot to discuss as far as pruning. Most persimmon orchardists or home gardeners will just allow the trees to grow, and they naturally will assume somewhat of a central leader type tree. Like pawpaws, about 1 ounce of actual nitrogen per year of age of the tree, up to about 6 to 7 ounces, is generally sufficient. And like pawpaws, persimmons are not particularly drought tolerant. They are a bit more drought tolerant, certainly, than persimmons or pawpaws, as you might expect from where you see them growing in nature. But in an orchard or in the home garden, they should be watered during dry spells. Just a few disease and insect issues have been reported on persimmons. There is a persimmon wilt disease and a persimmon leaf spot disease that occasionally are reported. Probably, though, we hear more about the persimmon twig girdler than anything else, but certainly tent caterpillars, persimmon is a host for that, and there are borers that can attack persimmons as well. As I mentioned, persimmon twig girdler, though, is oftentimes the one we notice. And in the summer, particularly after windy weather, we notice that there are persimmon branches on the ground under our trees. And if we look at them closely, we notice that they have been girdled. That upper picture shows a stem, and this is an insect that has, it's a type of weevil, and it actually will feed in a circular pattern around the persimmon twig, and they leave a little bit of wood in the middle, and then they lay their eggs in the piece that is the part that drops to the ground. And then the larvae hatch, they bore into that that part of the branch and they feed there. And oftentimes these twigs remain attached to the tree, or sometimes, as we see here, they break and drop to the ground. To manage this, just pick up all of these branches as they break and then dispose of them. You'll dispose of the problem. Now, persimmons are harvested when they're soft ripe. And again, with American persimmons, you have to wait till they're dead ripe and with assurance say that the astringency is gone. If you harvest them while they're still firm, they will still have astringency even if you leave them at room temperature till they soften. So they have to ripen on the tree. Typically, they're very perishable and difficult to handle at this point. Oftentimes, people will place tarps, sheets, or some sort of a catch frame under the tree to catch the fruit as it falls. You know, anytime you pick a persimmon forcefully off the tree, there's a good chance that fruit is astringent. But if it naturally drops, there's a good chance that the astringency is gone. Now, from the standpoint of marketing, persimmons can be marketed as fresh fruit, but again, so perishable that in most cases, farmers are going to be processing the fruit into pulp and then marketing the pulp. And persimmon, of course, can be used in value-added products as well. Some prices on persimmon, frozen persimmon pulp, nearly $25 a pound from one source and $12.50 a pint from another source. Some of the value-added products, again, ice creams, smoothies, custards can be made from persimmon. It is a very rich, delicious flavor that complements well dairy products. It can also be used in cooked products such as custard, cookies, and breads. And as is the case with pawpaws, they can be fermented into beer or wine. So some resources on persimmon here. And again, you can see a number of these are from the Eastern US from various sources. And that brings us to the end of the prepared presentation, but we still have plenty of time for any questions or further discussion. So at this point, please type your questions into the Q&A box and Hannah will share those with me.
All right, so we got a couple of questions. One is piggybacking on the pawpaws. Family Tree Co-op asks, on pawpaw, we heard you say that there are understory trees, but your pawpaw orchard photo appeared to be in full sun. The Zoom dropped out briefly, so maybe you covered this question already. We planned to plant pawpaw in the shade of a giant silver maple. Is that unnecessary? And if they do need the shade, does that maple have any, pardon my pronunciation, allelopathic considerations for pawpaw?
Okay, well, let's discuss this. So pawpaw in its native habitat is indeed an understory tree, but it can be grown to good effect in the full sun. If you plant a pawpaw in the full sun, it will be more productive than in the shade, and the fruit will be larger than in the shade. So don't have any qualms about planting pawpaw in the full sun. I would be a bit concerned about planting pawpaw under a silver maple. The root system on silver maple trees is extensive and shallow, and pawpaws are not particularly good competitors against an aggressive root system such as a silver maple would have. So my advice would be to not plant under the maple tree. Now, to my knowledge, there's no allelopathic effects from silver maples, so I don't think that's a concern. I think it's more a direct competition with the pawpaw root system for water and nutrients.
Awesome. So Lori Williamson says, thank you for doing this. This was excellent. Thank you, Lori, for that sweet comment. And Jane Victor asks, the persimmons we gathered in fall 2020 were delicious. Those that were gathered in fall 2021 were not as sweet and were very disappointing. What is the cause of the difference in flavor?
You know, that's an interesting observation, and we don't completely understand what goes on with persimmons and fruit quality, but it does seem that in those falls that are warm and not a lot of temperature changes, in other words, you know, consistently warm moving into the ripening season in late September and October, we tend to have sweeter, better tasting persimmons. Now, that doesn't hold true every year, but I would say in more years than not, the best quality fruit comes in a warm, consistent fall.
Cool. Again, if you guys have any other questions, feel free to submit them in the chat. Nicholas asks, this has been very informative. Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. How far up does the netting sit from the ground to catch the falling persimmons?
Yeah, that's a good point as well. You don't want it too close to the ground because you want the fruit to essentially land on a surface that is softer than the ground. And so having it up probably 6 to 12 inches is sufficient. But again, don't set it directly on the ground. That picture I showed the tarp on the ground, but basically the harvesters had set it down when I had a chance to take the picture. But normally it would have been held up by 2 harvesters, and then another person would be gently jarring the limbs of the tree to allow the fruit that was ripe to then drop on the tarp.
Awesome. Okay, so got a couple of questions on where this will be available and if the slides will be available. Yes, they will be. This will be posted in about 2 days or so on the YouTube. And I just posted in the chat to everyone oh, I guess not to everyone. Let me send it to everyone. So this is the link for the YouTube, so you can access this video in about 2 days or so. Jeremy Reese asks, what is the proper spacing when planting pawpaw trees, and how many trees can be planted in an acre?
Well, again, the spacing is fairly close within the rows. I think in my presentation, I'd said something like 6 to 8 feet. And then the spacing between the rows is determined by what you intend to drive between the trees. And if you want to get a pickup truck down or perhaps a small tractor, they may need to be as much as 10 to 12 feet apart. If you're just walking down the rows, that sort of thing, then they could be closer. Now, the number of trees per acre is determined by the spacing that you choose to use. And the common denominator to use there is there are 43,560 square feet in an acre. And so if you know that you're going to space your trees, let's say for convenience sake, you're going to space them 5 foot apart and 10 feet between the rows, each tree is going to occupy 50 square feet. So you divide, and I don't have my calculator handy, but you divide 43,560 by 50 to come up with the number of trees you're going to need to plant an acre.
Awesome. JC asks, do you have succession planting recommendations?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to, JC, as far as succession planting. I will say that both pawpaw, well, persimmon in particular, is an interesting tree in that it's one of the first trees that will colonize open areas. You know, for example, if there is a pasture that's not being managed, before long you have pawpaw or persimmons growing up in that pasture. Pawpaw is not a tree that does that. Pawpaw pretty much has a fairly narrow niche from the standpoint of its adaptation in nature. Now, we as gardeners and horticulturists can plant pawpaws wherever we want, and the trees will grow and be productive and such for us. But in nature, pawpaw tends to be found in a fairly narrow niche. Persimmon, on the other hand, can be found in lots of different habitats.
Yeah, persimmons are usually found around water sources, right?
Well, both of these trees, are would favor an area where there's abundant moisture. Now, neither tree will do well in waterlogged soil, of course, but persimmon can grow in drier areas. And I frequently drive down Highway 60 going towards southeast Missouri, and I regularly see persimmon trees growing in some fairly inhospitable spots along Highway 60. So they can endure extreme conditions. But if your goal is to produce a good quality crop of delicious fruit, then again, they'll respond to the care that you give them. Plant them in a good site, choose adapted cultivars, improved cultivars, and lavish care upon them, and they will certainly respond positively.
So JC, if you want to elaborate on what you meant by succession planting, feel free to do so, and we'll revisit that. We have a couple of other questions. Brian asks, when planting persimmon, can you plant the entire fruit, or should you use the seed as extracted from the flesh first?
That's a good question. In nature, in most cases, the agent that disseminates persimmon seeds is some sort of animal, a bear, a raccoon, a possum. and they eat the whole fruit. And then the seeds are left behind in the feces of the animal. And so I would say we want to kind of mimic that from the standpoint of growing these in the yard or in the garden or on the farm. And extracting the seed and planting them likely is going to be more successful than planting an entire fruit. You know, there are cases with other fruits that if you plant the entire fruit, there are actually substances in the flesh of the fruit that inhibit germination. And by taking the seed out of the fruit, you'll greatly improve your percentage of success.
So Nicholas Floyd asks, can pawpaws be trimmed back vigorously to maintain a smaller stature, assuming you can maintain proper structure?
You know, Nicholas, I have never tried pruning back a pawpaw heavily, so I don't have firsthand experience to share with you on that, and I don't know that I've come upon any reports of doing that in the literature, popular literature or professional literature. So I just don't know.
Is it a can it trail?
No, a pawpaw is typically more of an upright tree. It does eventually develop that nice pyramidal growth habit, but I think you should give it a try and then reach out to me and let me know how those trees do.
All right. And then JC got back to us in regards to the succession planting. In the context of production, should we space out the planting timing every 2 years or so, for example, as a production orchard?
Well, you know, if you have a goal in mind, let's say that your goal is an acre of pawpaws, and for whatever reason you don't want to bite off that big of a chunk initially, you can certainly plant, you know, a fourth of an acre this year, a fourth of an acre in a few more years, and build to the size that you would like to be. Or you can just, as I said, you know, bite it off in one chunk and plant the whole orchard. There are, you know, differing thoughts on the best approach. If you're new to orcharding and you want to cut your teeth on a situation that doesn't carry as much risk, plant a small orchard to start with, and then grow that orchard as your experience grows. Something else I'll mention too is that when you plant both persimmons and pawpaws, they're fairly small plants initially, and there's a lot of open space in that orchard if you plant at the spacings that I recommended. And there's plenty of room to grow a crop like elderberries or aronia, or perhaps even an annual crop in the area between the rows or even between the trees, until the trees get big enough to start shading those other parts of the orchard. So, companion plantings, there's a number of berries that would work really well with persimmons and pawpaws.
Awesome. That's it on the questions, but feel free to submit more questions. We still have a bit more time. And just for the hell of it, since we have so many participants here, I want to do a little personal poll of how many people have sliced open the persimmon seed to check for winter reports. Meaning, slicing the seed in half and checking the cotyledon to see if it's a fork, knife, or a spoon.
Yeah, we have several hands going up.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, that's great. I did that as well for a number of years, and I always found a higher percentage of spoons than knives and forks. And the other thing that makes it complicated is that oftentimes a spoon and a knife look a lot alike. There's kind of a fine line between what is a spoon-like knife and a knife-like spoon.
Right.
The forks are easy to tell. That's not a problem.
Yeah. Like if you slice it a certain way, if maybe it'll smush it into a knife. Yeah. Awesome. Willoughby says, show me that spoon. Family Tree Co-op asks, are there any permaculture methods used by orchardists for the pawpaw and persimmon?
Well, when we think about permaculture, oftentimes we think about guilds and communities of plants that we develop. And both of these trees are well suited to communities. Now, I'm a big fan of food forests. And, when you think about a food forest, you're dealing with levels. And pawpaws and persimmons are frequently a kind of a lower level type tree. And they work great in a food forest setting because they don't shade out the plants around them. And so they can be a very interesting plant to include in a guild. Hannah, have you lost me? Are you still there?
There?
Yep.
All right. Sorry about that.
The Zoom gremlins are at work again.
Yeah. What were you saying?
Yeah, I was saying that both of these trees are well suited for permaculture plans. They're great companion plants. They work well in guilds. They're easy to integrate into groupings because they don't cast particularly dense shade, in a wide area around them. So you can plant a number of different types of plants in close proximity to pawpaws and persimmons. So yeah, they're fabulous trees for permaculture settings.
Awesome. What about permaculture with animals, chickens, specifically chickens for pest control?
Well, there's been a certain amount of work reported using poultry for pest control in different types of fruits like apples and grapes and blueberries, and I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be effective under persimmons and pawpaws as well. And in fact, if you had drop fruit, particularly persimmons, I imagine the chickens would be happy to help eat that too.
Awesome. That looks like it's it on the questions. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. Willoughby says, great presentation. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. This has been great fun for me.
Yeah.
Okay, well, again, I'd encourage everyone with an interest in pawpaw to check out those two resources that I mentioned, which are Missouri specific. Those are both, I think, good sources of information. And please reach out individually if you'd like to discuss either of these crops. I'd be happy to chat with you, via email or on the phone. I think there's huge potential from the standpoint of growing these as profit centers on our farms. And they're, of course, fabulous trees for the home garden as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, everyone. And sorry for the mishap. Not sure what happened with the Zoom, but I'm glad we worked it out and everybody was able to come back on. Lori Williamson asked, can you place your email again? Yes, I will. Actually,
let me go ahead and pop that into
yeah. And I also put in the YouTube link, so that's there for you guys. In reference to the additional workshops that you were talking about in regards to grafting. Mm-hmm. That one link that I sent is great to check out the grafting emails, or I'm sorry, workshops.
And I'll mention that if you're particularly interested in grafting, we typically host grafting workshops in March here in Southwest Missouri. So stay in touch, and as we schedule those, we'll be happy to share the opportunities.
Awesome.
Okay. Well, if there aren't any further questions, Hannah, thank you very much for joining me this evening. And I want to thank everyone who was on our call tonight. And again, it's so exciting to hang out with people with common interests. So thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks so much. It was great talking to you. Bye.
Bye-bye all.